Welcome to Got Grass, conversations with the legends and leaders of bluegrass. You've enjoyed live bluegrass at Guitar Town CT concerts in Hampden, Connecticut since 2008. From Tony Rice, Rouse Stanley, and Doyle Lawson to Tim O'Brien, Sierra Hall, and Billy Strings. Now you can go behind the scenes as we chat with your favorite bluegrass stars. I'm your podcast host, Chris Worth.
It's just okay. Just audio, right?
Just audio. So I want to welcome Peter Rowan to Got Grass. Welcome. Nice to have you. I'm very happy to have you on.
Well, it's nice to meet you on the airwaves, as they say.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember, you played at Guitar Town back in, I think, 2011. There was a Bill Monroe tribute concert, and it was the Trial of the Nokories and you and Tony Rice who didn't show, but so I did.
Was it down in Texas or where was that?
No, Connecticut. I'm in Connecticut, Hampden, Connecticut. So that's where that took place, and that's where I am now. Anyway,
I see. All right. Yeah.
So I usually start these chats with a non-music question, which is, what would a perfect day off be for you?
A perfect day off, barring any catching up on busyness things, like the second or third day off the road when I'm a little bit more rested and I've taken care of whatever business needs to be taken care of from a work period. There's a sort of a nice period there where I kind of I relax. I don't do much. I'm working on I find that if I relax enough, that the whatever song cycle is coming together in my mind has a chance to kind of express itself. But at 84, it takes me a little more time to recover from these road trips. But there's always an inner dialogue going on, and I've for years tried to take notes. I'm a note taker, but I tend to take notes in verse form, like iambic pentameter, and I try and tell my songwriting students, or even just acquaintances that ask about it. It's just like I think learning verse forms is very important, and learning what iambic pentameter is. Stuff that goes back to the Greeks, to the earliest in the West, and the earliest written forms, And I look at Chinese poetry, and I try and just see how that language works. And the famous Irish poet Seamus Heaney said, you can't hunt down the muse. You have to let the muse find you in the woods, in the dark woods of your thought processes. And so I kind a perfect day for me is the day when those gentle wheels are turning, and just feeling refreshed in my mind, that kind of thing. It's usually in a little rest period after traveling a lot. And even a day off on the road is not that relaxing. So it's usually, I usually get back to some aspect of nature too. But a perfect day is the day when the things I've not been able to think about so much because of the performing schedule, but the things that inspire me are sort of waking up again. That's a good day for me.
Do you always carry a pencil and a pad with you when you're relaxing so you can jot things down that come to mind, or how do you?
I carry ink pens. Although I've kind of gone to ballpoints recently. There's some good Japanese ballpoints, and of course the old German ones. But I have a couple of fountain pens that I favor. They seem to have a little bit of a flow on the page, you know. And I have too many notebooks now. It's just obscene, really. I've got every size notebook, and the ones I like best are too heavy to carry. So I have one of Tex Logan's old Bell Lab journals, and I was thinking it weighs a ton, but Tex Logan was a real dear friend of mine and a musical compatriot, and I have one of his uh, lab diaries, and it's empty, and it's the perfect thing. I mean, it's the perfect size. You know, it's 12 by 14. It's huge. But you know, I just finished a memoir, and most of the notes on that memoir from a road trips I was taking with Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. It's a pocket-sized thing. It's barely larger than one of those little folding pocket diaries, you know, that just fit in your a shirt pocket. One of those old-time hardware store little pads, a notepad. And this I got used to writing sort of like haiku rhymes and things, but that's my entire diary was. And I've used about half of it. I haven't used some of the more sort of extraneous things from our trip to England back in the 65, 66, yeah. But Ralph Rinsler, who was Doc Watson's manager and Bill Monroe's manager, and created the Smithsonian Folklife department, really, and was mandolin player in the Greenbrier Boys. He urged me to keep a diary. He said, "You've got to keep a diary, and you never know what you know." Because I was very spaced out when I went to work with Bill Monroe, and I was kind of like existentially just kind of in the space. I wasn't writing anything about it, and then I began to feel like, wow, I'm really not doing anything with my brain. I'm just vegging, you know, just trying to kind of absorb the world of bluegrass in the South, the segregated South of the 1960s. And then I remember, and it's in my memoir, the first time I wrote a song was the first time we left Nashville and went on the road, went up to Michigan and came back. And you know, all you heard on the radio at that time was country music. And you heard, it was before Willie, I mean, it was before Willie left Nashville. He was still in Nashville. And he'd play on the Opry on nights we were on there. And so it was very much a country music vibe. And I mean, you didn't go out around the hills of Tennessee and hear banjos ringing by any means. Um, the whole bluegrass scene was of its own little world, you know. But the great names that I'll mention, a few people that you might have seen at a time in the bluegrass world were people like Porter Church from up in Maryland way, great banjo player. Um, Billy Baker, another. I think he had some Native American in him. He very jet black hair, very dark, very contained individual. He didn't say much, but he played great fiddle. Of course, Red Allen, Frank Wakefield, up that in the Midwest area, up in Ohio and stuff. And then there was this sort of like far reach down through Louisiana, and way down into Florida, or southern Louisiana, actually, and Rule Yarborough and his partner. Gosh, I can't remember, but these were people that you would see, and there was no IBMA to bring everyone together. In fact, the first thing that drew people together was Carlton Haney's first bluegrass festival over there in Fincastle, Virginia. That's when the people started showing up, and you got the country-ish bluegrass crowd, and then you got a lot of people that were college students that were interested in bluegrass. People like Maine Smith and oh gosh, oh I'm sorry, but folks that were involved with universities, my age people, you know, and they were showing up and they were writing articles about books. Neil Rosenberg, you know, who's up in Canada now in a folk life department, but he was living up in Bloomington, and so you had this cycle of interest, and I would see Neil when I went up to play Bean Blossom with Bill Monroe, and then he shows up at the first Bluegrass Festival, and suddenly this whole wide net of people begin to talk to each other, and we're aware of each other. And it's interesting, the Jerry Garcia exhibit over at the IBMA Museum in Owensboro, Kentucky, the Jerry Garcia Life in Bluegrass exhibit actually features him as somebody who actually drove with Sandy Rothman from the West Coast in a little Corvair. And then they have the front end of a Corvair at the museum, and they have a little board where you can touch these towns that Jerry went to, and it shows up on a screen as what he did there. And he went all around, I would say from the middle of the country south, he was everywhere. I think you've got as far as Pennsylvania. So he knew somebody at University of Pennsylvania, or Sandy did. And if you push these little buttons, and it has a little star and it lights up, and then it tells you who he saw there and what he did there. It's an amazing exhibit. And you have to think of it that Jerry was planning to audition for Bill Monroe. And he did this trip with Sandy Rothman. They went all over the country one summer, I think. David Grisman remembers meeting him at Sunset Park in Pennsylvania, where from the stage you'd look out over the audience on these pine board benches on stumps, and surrounding them would be these silhouetted black buggies, horse and buggies, and it was the Amish people. The Amish people wouldn't, I mean, they would sit down on the little benches as well, but they would bring their horses and buggies, and it was sort of the outer perimeter of the crowd. It was something to see, it was so different back then, really so different. And so when these little parks and these little festivals started happening more and more, then there was a world of bluegrass that began. And I think the IBMA called it right, the world of bluegrass, because it wasn't, there was no unifying factor of it until this little world started to be created. And Jerry was the first guy to go out and look at that world on his own.
And it's funny. I was just talking to Alice Gerard, who I'm sure you know. She's 91,
gosh, yeah.
And she remembers these parks and camps where people sat on benches and brought food, and everybody would show up, from the Stanley Brothers to Bill Monroe to Tommy Gerald to Hazel Dickens to Ola Belle Reed. I guess this is back in the '60s. She was talking about way before IBMA, and it was fascinating to hear that from her. It's a whole part of the world that, like, people like me up here had never heard about. I don't know about that. I mean, I'm a Connecticut boy. I grew up in the Beatles, and
Right,
so,
but there was a whole scene you never knew about, and I never knew about, but because I was young. In my teenage years, I had a little rockabilly band called the Cupids, and that got me out and about around Boston, and I discovered the Hillbilly Ranch with the Lilly Brothers. That over in Harvard Square, you had the Club 47 with the Charles River Valley Boys, Bill Keith and Jim Rooney. But they were my first bosses, first bluegrass guys I ever worked for, were Bill Keith and Jim Rooney. And then you had, it was secret. I mean, it was legendary. There were just legends around. I got to hang out with Tex Logan a lot, and we remained friends for a long time and worked and made records. But there were people like, Joe Val was a force, but it was a tiny world. But from Joe, I would hear about people that he admired, like Connie and Babe. I don't have no idea who those people were, but there was one legendary guy who was a flat picker, and his name was Fred Pike. And I was working with Bob French and the Rainbow Valley Boys and Sweetheart, and Fred would come in. Fred and Bob French were friends, but Bob French was a great car mechanic, and I remember him complaining that his banjo chops were a mess because he had to keep working with these wrenches and oils under the car and stuff. He was a good friend of Sonny Osborne's. And but then there was this legendary guy, Fred Pike, and I finally got to meet him, and there was just no play, unless it was the corner bar, there was no place to play. I mean, so this little tiny world of bluegrass existed in a very sort of, esoteric way. In fact, John Hartford said, um, in the world of bluegrass, having the IBMA suddenly show up as a huge sort of umbrella, he said, was like having General Electric, come to your town and take over the utilities of your little town.
Yeah.
Because, you know,
Well,
but
here's the question I have for you, which I wonder about. So you grew up in Boston. You were a good-looking guy. You had a great voice. You could play guitar. Why didn't you become a rock guy? Like, what was it about bluegrass that drew you away from what would have been probably the norm in those days to be like a rocker?
well, I think it was a Bobby Rydell played my high school, and he had records out. But when I saw his show, it was just like our show. It was just like you're playing a record hop, really. Um, uh, that was our gigs, was the record hopping. But what happened was there was a thing called the payola, and all these DJs that were, you know, sort of colorful personalities. That one guy, Arnie Woo Woo Ginsburg, who you can look up. There's a whole history of him and streaming of some of his rock and roll shows. Arnie Woo Woo Ginsburg. And the woo woo was a little car horn like Harpo Marx. Woo woo Ginsburg, honk honk. And but these were characters, and he was the only guy who gave us $4 for gas. But we played these places for free because it was our age group, and our age group was loved those dances that began at 6:30 on a Saturday night and were over by 8:30, and we played them all, and we had a good following, and then we started to get bookings for uh, uh, dances, just regular dances like junior high dances, and the best gig we ever had was a parochial school, and held their it was all girls school, and there was about 50 kids and five nuns, and we were the band, and there was a maypole, and I mean, in my memory, that was the best gig we ever got because it was at the West Bridgewater Canoe Club up there in Bridgewater, Mass. And,
Oh man.
and I mean, but those were innocent days, and everybody was on the track to go to college that was in the band. It was like, this is what you were expected to do. And so when I got to be, well, put it this way, uh, Joan Baez was 17 when we, as a group, and I had discovered the 47 Club. I had heard Eric von Schmidt play the music of Leadbelly there, and I started learning those songs, and I just thought they were great songs. And I didn't have acoustic guitar at the time, but I had my Telecaster, and I started going, oh, yeah, that acoustic guitar looks good. And then I saw a D28. I saw a bluegrass rhythm guitar, the standard bluegrass rhythm guitar is that big Martin D28. And when I heard that, it was like I started getting stolen away by the sound of that guitar. And really, I would have to say, as a bluegrass singer, that's how I started to really uh, learn to sing, because it's a loud guitar, and you have to. It it was like having a powerful musical accompaniment. And bluegrass, of course, has banjos and fiddles and all else. But when you start singing some songs when you're home and you're sitting in the little room and you strum that big guitar, you got to match it. You have to match it with your voice, and that and playing. So yeah, that was a transition. But I was 15 when we went. We still have the Cupids going. And I think the oldest guy in the band the lead guitarist was 17. So he went off to school at 18. And so we didn't really have the band anymore, you know. And I was still trying to go to school, you know. I went through 2 years of college as well. But all during that time, I began to be attracted to the simplicity of that guitar, you know. And um, it was, you could carry that guitar with you. And as I went around and started hearing people like Joe Val, uh, I would be wanting to learn songs, and Joe was so generous. He, Joseph Valiente, famous New England, you know, mandolin player, and he said, "What am I going to call my band?" I said, "Call it the New England Bluegrass Boys." And I never thought of how that might have, like, Bill Monroe might have like gone, "What?" You know, but he did. He had the New England Bluegrass Boys, which I thought was great because it was a nod. It was like saying this is one of the outposts of the real deal, you know, bluegrass boys, rather than, you know, string band or whatever. But, you know, as I was only 15, I could get into folk clubs. I mean, there was no in between playing the high school dances. You couldn't play in a bar. You had to be 21 to play in a bar. Although I did play in the Hillbilly Ranch just because I carried my instrument in, and they just looked at me and they go, "Oh, he's in the band," you know. So that made things easier. But what the coffee houses were, oh, they let you in free if you came with an instrument. They just figured you were part of the scene that was developing. And things began to change when Clarence White and the Kentucky Colonels showed up and played in Boston at a bar that sold alcohol but still allowed underage kids to come in. And that kind of changed things because here come these guys from the West Coast, and they're sleeping on mattresses up above the club, and it was like, well, this is a whole other level of involvement in a career. You know what I mean? It's like, this is all you guys do, right? You know, and then that became the goal. Where can I where can I go where I can do this all the time? You know, and be immersed in music. You know, music took over, but the acoustic instruments were the transition. Be- Just mostly because there was no place to play rockabilly music at 15, 16 years old that paid you. There was no money in it. So there was money. I started playing mandolin for Jim Rooney and Bill Keith. You know, we started getting paid, and I could move out. You know, this was 3 years later. I was 18, went to college, and really I was 20 when I went full time music and didn't live at my mom's and dad's house, and was staying over at Jim Rooney's house. Uh, Jim and Bill were roommates, and I had this little cot, little tiny room, you know, but I was making $20 or $30 a week. That was money back then. And the only time I had to move out was when Doc Watson came to town, because then Doc would take my bed. So Doc and I became friends, you know. And Doc was 35, because I remember I was 20 and he was 35. So that's the same age that Tex, Logan, and Joe Val were 15 years older than I was. And I began to see how this sort of generational thing was working. I didn't think of me as a separate generation, but because those guys were nice people and they invited me in, that became home base, home plate musically. You see what I'm saying? Is
I do. Yeah, I
there
understand.
there wasn't really, there was a rock and roll scene beginning in Boston, and you know, let's see, you know, 8, 9 years later, the Boston Tea Party was a club, and uh, there was a Boston radio station that had been just a news channel, and it was bought by some forward-thinking people, and it became WBOS, I think. And they started playing rock and roll, but that was, you know, in the mid '60s.
that was later.
Yeah, it's but not that. I mean, things were changing very fast, in terms of popular culture.
So let me
But the
ask you this
bluegrass,
question.
yeah, the bluegrass world became its own world. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you were singing and playing in bands and performing and going to coffee houses. By the way, did you fall in love with Joan Baez when you first saw her? She was so gorgeous. I just wonder if you had a romantic thing for her.
I worshiped at her feet, and in fact, the other day, a year ago, we did a thing for Jack Elliott out here. She always recognizes me as that kid who sang doo-wop with her outside the Club 47. But aside from a tune I wrote called Joaquin Murrieta, that she asked if I would give her a tape. I'm so lazy, I never did. Um, but we always kind of like remember there's always something, because she started pulling on my hair while we were listening to the show for the Jack Elliott benefit. I mean, she kind of tugged on the back of my head, and it was like, that's Joan. I mean, see, I didn't know her deeply. I knew her sister Mimi a little better.
Sure.
But there was another. That was sort of the in crowd. You know what I mean? And she rose very fast. I don't know if you've read her book, but while I was watching from the outside, this girl in 2 or 3 years was just up rocketing to the top of the world. At the same time that Bob Dylan was doing his thing. And so it was like that's the world of the fast rising people. But there were all kinds of people around, like Eric Anderson and Eric von Schmidt, and it was exciting because there was a mix of music going on, and
Yeah, there's
really,
music everywhere, right? All kinds of
yeah,
music everywhere.
okay, yeah. And then the whole Boston University scene was mostly art school people, like Bobby Newirth. They'd come over to Cambridge, and it was great. Whatever song you had at the moment, and I miss that, really. I do now, because where can kids go? They go to the internet, but and that has its own, connection. Once you connect with people and you can collaborate with them, but back then you had to really go like on the ground down south. I drove down south to see Doc and stayed at his Willard Watson's place, and Willard had running water, and he said, "You come here, youngins, look at this. I got running water now." And they had installed a faucet in the sink with a pipe out to the creek behind the house and left it on all the time, and says, it's running water.
Yeah. So did Bill Monroe hear about you, or you heard about him? How did you end up singing and playing
Well,
for Bill?
there's always more to it than meets the eye. So Ralph Rinsler had been working with Bill, and when you when you meet people in the music business, there's those people that are devoted to the music part, and then those people that want to make a business out of everything. And Bill Monroe didn't have really much of a, I mean, I'm going to generalize, but Bill Monroe didn't seem to have much of a business sense. He'd probably been ripped off. And I know that Kentucky Waltz was huge contention. It's in the big book there by his guitar player. Um, I had no idea that he had years of lawsuits over Kentucky Waltz. It was one of his biggest sellers. The melody comes from a Hawaiian song, Pualilia, and whoever brought that tune to Bill claimed he wanted half of the tune, that he had written the lyrics, and Bill Monroe, because he saw the response to people, he tried to keep that song for himself, and it resulted in huge legal hassle. I never knew about that, but that's the business side of it. Bill was more like just a musical force, and Ralph Rinsler and Mike Seeger were two people of the urban world who were really appreciative of what bluegrass was about. And so they had taken up the cause of Bill Monroe, and they wrote an article that was published in Sing Out magazine, which was a folk music magazine of the times, published in New York, I think by the Folklore Center. Irwin Silber, maybe. Anyway, they were all involved in this whole thing. It was explosive, and Dylan was coming along. And uh, the article was that they wrote together called the grandpappy of bluegrass or something, and it was all about Bill Monroe, who was sort of a forgotten musical force outside of the country music world, which was from the Grand Ole Opry down in Nashville. And they started bringing him up north. And I always wondered why Bill was just sort of like, he nothing phased him in terms of it was just sort of like, oh, this is the part of the legend of me that I'm going to live now. He was just sort of there in the music without, I mean, when I was his road manager, he'd say, "You make sure that man pays you, Pete." It was like, oh, yeah, okay. I mean, there was a lot of weird things going on, even in the bluegrass world, with promoters and they what who Moon Moon Mullins DJ was it
Right.
Moon
Yeah.
Mullins?
Yeah.
He once Elvis had gone electric. I mean, had just purely gone, electric, because his early stuff, man, was like some of them. There's not even a drum; it's just an acoustic guitar. Um, they call that something. They had a nickname for it. It was a starvation time, bluegrass starvation time, because what was bubbling along very successfully were these access to this music that has so much appeal, and then was very much eclipsed by, you would have to say, I guess rock and roll is what it was. Uh, and then Elvis quickly became a commercial entity. So the definition of popular music was, oh, you gotta, there's the guy at the top, and you gotta follow that. But Bill Monroe never changed. He didn't change his tune or his music, and it was just almost like he would just show up and be Bill Monroe. And so Ralph and Mike were trying to figure out a way to tap the college market, which was big into folk music. So they had Bill Monroe come up to Boston, and Bill Keith put a band together for him and asked if I'd play guitar. And he, he said, and I'm going to play banjo. Bill Keith said that. And said, but you can't call me Bill because there can only be one Bill in Bill Monroe's band. You have to use my middle name, and that's Bradford. So you'd call me Brad or Bradford. I said, okay, Brad, and it was true. Bill had asked him not to use his real name, but to use his middle name. And he gave me a name. He gave me a new name, Pete Roanes, Roanes. That's what he called me. And I thought, man, I should have taken that name and had a career under Pete Roanes. Yeah. So we started playing colleges with Bill flying solo up to New England. And then we played a big gig at Harvard University at Jordan Hall. And then we played Symphony Hall. And at this time, Ralph was recording Doc Watson and Bill Monroe singing the Monroe Brothers songs, which didn't come out until later. But I think it's been well documented now on commercial releases, either through Vanguard or I don't know. I mean, I don't even know if Vanguard exists anymore. But it was the time of folk music, and they legitimized Bill Monroe's pedigree of being a progenitor of this music, not an accidental guy who just said, yeah, well, I think I'll throw a couple of fiddles in there. No, Bill Monroe's music was very self-directed. What he wanted and what he found, musicians began to know what he was looking for. So they would say, Bill, can I audition on, fiddle, banjo, guitar? And I mean, he was very popular among musicians because suddenly bluegrass allowed everybody to have a place in an ensemble. You didn't have to have electric guitar. You didn't have to have drums. You just guitar, banjo, fiddle, bass. It's like, wow, mandolin, because
So
he
Bill's
organized. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say Bill Monroe is famous for how many hundreds of people played for him, went through his bands.
I think it was 225 people or something like that.
So
Yeah.
what do you attribute that to? Is it because I mean, people say, well, he didn't pay them very well, or he just traveled by himself and found local guys to play with him.
He just made
What's
do. If he didn't have a band, he'd find local guys,
yeah.
But what the question you're asking is really what was uh, attractive about Bill was, as in the words of Richard Greene, he was a musical truth. He was an actual truth. And I have to say that there was this thing in the Bill Monroe, the big book, the life story, the music and record recording career. Tom, I won't say Ellis, but Tom Ellis was one of the banjo players. Uh, you know this book, right? It's the biggest, thickest book you've ever
Yes.
read.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, there's something in there about the four skinny guys that Ralph and Mike Seeger were. They were going, wow, if we get four young 20-year-olds in this band, suddenly Bill Monroe will look like a contemporary, like the Beatles. That's what they were saying. I didn't know about this until I read the book. And then I started thinking, yeah, that was definitely, you could see that as us, as 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds, uh, with a hat on and wearing a suit, we did have a good image, and it was a very young image for Bill. And so there was, this is just a rumor, I don't know, but Tom, I think it was just part of the picture. If you're going to play colleges, there's Bill with, some of his oldest friends playing in the band and playing authentically, but then you've got, okay, me and Richard Greene, Lamar Greer, Gene Lowinger, and James Monroe, we're all in our 20s. And we never looked at ourselves like, wow, aren't we cool? We're 20-year-olds. I had no idea. It's just who we were. But I can see how somebody might think, that is pretty slick. You put the epic guy is just 50 years old with people half his age, and you've got something very appealing, you know. And but that's what we were. We were young and very eager, attracted to Bill mostly because he's the guy, because he had a truth. There was a truth to what he did, and his his dharma, there was all the side stuff too, the good, the bad, and Bill and how he related with women and this and that, but he was a force of nature and a very complicated guy who would sometimes be so vulnerable, so hurt. He had he if he got his feelings hurt, he was a very unhappy guy. But the fact that he could have his feelings hurt set him apart as well. So he seemed to be very distant to a lot of people. He wasn't going to let a lot of people get close to him, and the idea was that everybody thought that that he was just self-protective because they'd all taken his music or something like that. And I think that he might have felt that at a certain point, but then he started to realize, my God, he is the father of bluegrass music, you know, and that was very appealing. Just not to think of like him as a father, but he certainly was very fatherly to us. He treated us like his sons.
Oh, I mean, his image, there are other people in the music too that have this image of kind of like a reclusive kind of guy that is not approachable, but maybe it was just because he was more sensitive than people realized. I mean, right? He had a sensitive side, could easily be hurt, and he didn't maybe want people to know that or see that. But
Well, if you listen to him with his brother Charlie, the guy was fully formed. Nothing really changed except his playing. It went through different phases, but he was already as a, I don't know how old they were, the Monroe brothers, but they came out of the woods, went up to work, as dancers on WLS in Chicago. I mean, they were young. And there's pictures of Bill in the Charlie Monroe Bear Records collection. There's a picture of Bill with hair down over his shoulders. And at some point, he.
oh
that's
man, that's hard to believe.
Well, you got to look at it. It's in the Bear family Charlie Monroe collection. There's a
Okay.
picture of Bill and Charlie with several women, and Bill is like laying on the ground with his mandolin, and his hair is hanging down over his shoulders. I swear, he here we are working with him, and he's like, Pete, you need to have that haircut. And I'm like, I said, well, I knew him well enough. I could kid him a little bit. And I said, well, why is that? But why do you want us to have short hair, Bill? And he says, well, if you had seen some of the boys that come out of the woods, wanted to be bluegrass boys with a hank of hair hanging down on one side and the other side bald, he said you'd want to have everybody have a little bit of a haircut, And it was the same way with the clothing.
Yeah.
I mean, early on, during the rise of the Third Reich, Bill had those riding pants on. He looked. I mean, I wouldn't say it was a Nazi uniform, but it was definitely the boss man. It was the guy who rode the horse and made sure everybody did their row. Uh, riding breeches on stage. It was like pretty far out. Knee-high boots. You know,
Right.
and it just sort of by coincidence, that's what the costuming of was the rise of authoritarianism in Germany. That's what their costume was, the guy who would be on the horse. I did a record with Don Edwards, cowboy singer, and we called it The High Lonesome Cowboy. And in it, I wrote an essay about some liner notes about the fact that not everybody had a horse in the days of before the automobile. Not everybody had a horse. Some people had to walk miles to go to work or whatever, or ride in a wagon. Bill Monroe rode in the wagon. He talked about riding in the wagon and with his Uncle Penn and bringing lumber up to Owensboro to put on the ferry boats and go. There was a market there. It was a big waterfront market. Of shipping basically, and Bill remembers riding the wagon. That's about 30 miles riding the wagon over there to Owensboro, and he didn't like the people in Owensboro. He thought they were snooty
Uh-huh.
because they'd laugh at these guys from the woods with their lumber. They'd laugh. It was success. People were women with parasols, and it was a river town. Owensboro was a river town, so it's ironic that the museum is right there in Owensboro, the very place that Bill thought was too snooty. But no, I don't know, man. The thing about bluegrass too is it encapsulates history. I mean, you still got tunes from the 1600s that are being played today in bluegrass music. You know, uh,
Yep.
and it there's such a I would say virtue, a power and a strength in those deep roots. And what I've tried to do is expand that a little bit, but I don't think I ever made a bluegrass record that wasn't a bluegrass record. And you have to look at Muleskinner as a really a transitional sort of. I mean, people would say country rock, but it wasn't at all. It was electric bluegrass. We didn't the rock element was just how far would you take it? If Jim Keltner had been the drummer, might have had it might have changed and gone into a swing, more of a. In other words, once you add drums to bluegrass, how much of bluegrass is left? Because the timing thing is, there's a sort of floating rhythmic interplay in bluegrass. And the only drummer that there's two drummers, Larry Adamaniuk, who played with Emmylou Harris and Sam Bush and Allison. He's an old friend of mine from Seatrain. He came out of Canada. He came out of Ronnie Hawkins' band. And he was two drummers removed from Levon Helm up there. And you have to think about, well, what was Seatrain all about when it wasn't playing those, classically oriented songs? It was an electric bluegrass band. It just, we didn't focus on that. But, Orange Blossom Special was our closer every night. It was like, it's just an aspect, right? And then the same, me and Richard were bluegrass boys, and we're in Seatrain, and then we were together in Muleskinner with David Grisman and the great Clarence White. It's just like we were just skating around. It was like, oh, if you do this, we can make a lot of money. It wasn't like that. It was like, if we do this, we can get paid. Oh, really? That's great. Because you didn't always get paid. But so there was a social rise, a rise in the business interest, and a rise in the musical flexibility. But I was in Japan. I just want to say I was in Japan, and my friend Saburo Watanabe, he said, to Americans, they think in different categories. He said, over here, we thought Seatrain was an electric bluegrass band that just played different music. I mean, it's all from the perspective of where you are. It's like, oh, well, bluegrass Seatrain wasn't being marketed as bluegrass, but to the listener who knew what the elements were, they go, wow, oh, there's a couple of bluegrass boys in this band. What does that make it? Yeah. It's
so you have a real world view of life and music, which I think is not that typical among bluegrass guys in the South. But let me ask you this question. What was it that drew you and Tony Rice together? Because Tony was my introduction to bluegrass and my musical hero, among others. But what was it about you and Tony that you connected so well? Because you seem in some ways quite different. But
well, we were different in many ways, but we were playing the Merle Watson Festival one year, and somebody decided to have us co-host the Midnight Jam. And he was playing with Norman Blake at the time, playing, inside, you might call it, inside of the form. And we started playing, and I was always like, no, the first time we played actually was on stage late night at the old Gray Fox, when it used to be called...
Right, I know what you mean. I
but
can't
Mary Nancy Talbot's festival.
Yeah,
it was.
Doesn't matter. We these things come back to us,
and they go away.
They come. Yeah.
But we had that was recorded. I did an Irish tune called "She Moves Through the Fair," and I'll tell you what Tony liked about me was I was willing to take chances. And what made him famous, of course, was playing with an incredibly solid backup, expanding his role as a guitar player in bluegrass. I mean, there was Clarence White, and Doc always was there, but there was also Don Reno. Don Reno played guitar. And Tony found where, something very unique about from jazz. So his favorite guitar player was Grant Greene. He listened to Oscar Peterson play piano on his home stereo, because we talked about all this. Those were the types of influence he liked, that kind of like connecting all the dots, and just like playing a 5-chord in a bluegrass song, but playing a diminished interpretation, or an augmented, a fancy jazz chord, or what they in bluegrass call the off chord. Tony knew where the off chords were, but the great glee with which he approached his adaptations to bluegrass via the guitar, just unbelievable. Nobody took it that far. Even Clarence just pretty much. Well, I mean, Clarence was right on the edge, but when it came down to guitar development, I think Tony he he just drew on a different genre. He drew from Oscar Peterson, Grant Greene, and he had listened to a lot of jazz. He liked jazz.
I remember, yeah,
Yeah,
Tony played here with this band 4 times in the mid 2000s. And on the few times I would have a chance to actually talk to him, since I was the promoter and I had to worry about paying and the sound system,
yeah,
yada yada.
yeah,
But we
yeah,
would sit down in the green room and he talked about Oscar Peterson, who is my favorite jazz musician of all time. And he talked about
yeah,
John Coltrane. And he
yeah,
said, I really see myself more in that realm than, I mean, I love bluegrass, but I
yeah,
really, I like the way those guys approach music.
yeah.
And I was fascinated by that.
Yeah, I thought he would have gone all the way and had gone into jazz, but he finished. I think the album was called Native American, which is a funny sort of title with all the meanings that it can have. But at that point, I think he used some drums, and I was always saying to him, I said, "Why don't you just go all the way, man? Hire jazz musicians to back you up." He said, "Oh God," he said, you know, I don't know. I think maybe it just was too daunting,
Right.
because
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I could hear it. When he made that record, I was around in Nashville, and I heard some outtakes of. I think there were drums on that record, but it was like he was just on the edge of going into jazz. And of course, with Grisman, he had already been into jazz. It's just that I don't know. It's something about. I mean, a real jazz drummer. Somebody with incredible amount of flexibility and taste could have you know complimented Tony and taken it into that thing because you know I don't know, he had his genre, he had his world that he liked, and for me as a songwriter it was incredible, the best accompaniment in the world for a song, but
Well, that brings me to the question of your quartet with Tony and Bryn and
Brandon and
Billy and
Sharon,
Tara and Sharon. So,
yeah,
I mean, there's one famous clip on YouTube which I love when you're doing the song White Dove, and it was a time, it was early 2000s. I think Bryn and her husband Billy were not even
yeah,
speaking at the time. But the
right.
great thing about that was that I think Tony suggested the song. He whispered in your ear, White Dove, you did it. And then Tony came around to the mic, slung his guitar over his shoulder, and sang the baritone part. And the crowd went crazy because this was when he wasn't singing anymore.
He
And
sang
I
the
found,
bass part. That
yeah,
was
the
a
bass
bass.
part. And I
Yeah.
found that so emotional for me, just to like he just did it with you guys. It was just, I don't know, it's one of my favorite
No,
vivid
you're right.
memories.
It was a huge moment. It was at Merlefest, and what he also did, he would he had his hair in an elastic, like elastic hair thing to hold his hair back. When he was going to sing, he would pull the hair out of the elastic and let it hang down all over, and just come up to the microphone and sing the bass part.
Yeah,
And it was like,
it was beautiful.
yeah, it was incredible. It was moving, extremely moving, because we had the trio part, um, and Billy has really developed as a singer since then. But at the time, it was like, well, do the best you can with what you got, and Bryn was starting to sing a lot of harmony, And Billy, yeah, we taught him the baritone part. It's all a growth period. All of these phases are growth periods. And so at the time there, I was totally inspired to write new songs. You know, I mean, Tony could make every song sound unique and beautiful. But I think his heart was really somewhere else. I know he did some recordings with Dan Kaminsky and occasional live shows with Dan. And Dan was playing with Alison Krauss, and Tony was playing with me. And he liked what he was doing with Dan Kaminsky better. I think he just loved bluegrass. I think in the end, he liked bluegrass better than, you know, jazzgrass or
I think
anything.
you're right. I think that was just where he felt most happy was with that music.
Well, I think he had worked harder and longer on uniqueness in that genre and didn't want to like just diffuse it into some kind of, but
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, I just loved his, backup playing, rhythm playing, because he had me holding the song together. He didn't have to sing anymore. And he just put the greatest stuff in there, maybe, it wasn't like Tony Rice just goes back up, there was no headlines. He just did it, and we did okay, we did okay. But I have to say, Tony was, although I did all the grunt work, leading the band kind of thing, trying to get to the sound check in time and organize everything. Tony,
He would never
it was
do sound check, right?
well, he would, but Tony would just show up.
Yeah.
And that's the way it worked the best. He'd just show up and like, whoa, oh, here we go. We never rehearsed. I don't think we ever rehearsed. Maybe in the studio we go over the tune once and then just get a take.
Well, that's what I heard from when he first played here as an acoustic all instrumental band. He had Rob Ikes with him, and he said we never rehearsed. We just showed up at the gig. We didn't know what we were going to play. Some of the songs I had never even played before. Rob said, like the
Yeah.
Miles Davis stuff, and he
was doing that stuff then. Okay.
Yeah, he was doing whatever, all blues or something, and Rob was behind the curtain backstage going with Ricky Simpkins saying, "How does this song go? I don't know this song," and it was on the set list, and that was just the way it happened. But I mean, for me, Tony Rice's genius was his rhythm playing. I mean, he was a tremendous lead player, tremendous singer, band leader, but his rhythm guitar playing to me is like never matched and never copied. I don't know. It's just phenomenal to me. So,
Yeah, you had to play to what he was doing.
Yeah.
You couldn't try and define everything. You had to listen more.
Can we talk a little about your songwriting? I'm thinking of one song that is very well known of yours called Midnight Moonlight. How did that song come about? I guess you should preface this by saying when I think of you, your name, and the images that come to mind are like the Southwest, Native American spirits, yodels, marijuana, the way you hold your guitar up way up by your neck. I don't know. How does that all work out into a song like Midnight Moonlight, which just has so many images and it's, I don't know, a very unique, beautiful song. How did that song come about?
Well, your first question was what's a perfect day?
Mm-hmm.
I had given my notice with Seatrain, and we had finally gotten beyond the Mississippi River, and we were playing. We played through Kentucky and stuff. And then we ended up in San Antonio, Texas, for our last little show. And at that time there was not like a whole lot of air conditioning in houses, and so on a good night, it was a spring. It was April of 60. No, I'm sorry, April of 72 or 3 or something. You'd go out and you walk around in the cool of the evening on an April night in almost any city, and there'd just be a lot of people out on their stoops, what they call stoops, which was like a porch or a sitting area with the front.
Stoop, yeah.
front steps.
Yep.
And that's the first thing I found about San Antonio was that everybody was making eye contact. You know, it didn't matter I was a gringo or they were Spanish or anything like that. It was kind of like, it's just a beautiful night, you know, and a perfect day, really. And I, the band went back to regroup for our next weekend show in DC, and I stayed on in Texas for that week. And it was just a series of the perfect days. It's just, you know, I stayed at the Holiday Inn over there, where it's still there, but all that part of town is gone. It was the beginning of the West Side barrio, and now it's all gone, and there's a token mercado, and the actual West Side now begins on the west side of I-35 or 281, over on that side of town. When I was there, I didn't know that it was the end of an era, but it was a lot of people a little older than I were, maybe my age. You know, they didn't know who I was. A long-haired gringo kid, you know, and I would just go in these little bars that they were nothing more than really just a wooden shack kind of thing. But I don't mean shack in that it was run down. It was just all like made out of fresh sawn, you know, with lumber.
Yeah.
And that the whole town was taken down in the years after that, and the huge parking lot over there, and I don't know what's there now. It could be anything. There was a bank. They put a bank in. Yeah, tear down the whole part of town and just build a bank. That's all anybody cares about. You know, but I stayed and I would hear music at night, you know, and I'd go over to a little church just across the way, and there'd be people dancing to accordion music, and I was shy, and they weren't used to seeing a gringo white kid hanging out on their culture. But I just had such a love for that feeling of community that I wasn't really a part of, but that I was drifting into, you know. I mean, everything from you could buy three tacos for lunch for $1.25, but you couldn't drink a beer in the restaurant. You had to go to the pool hall next door to drink a beer. You know, that kind of stuff. Like, it was like so much like the South, you know. It was just kind of like, wow, it was really sort of weird sort of rules. And, you know, and then I loved wandering around San Antonio between the Alamo and the big old churches over there. And then, you know, it was not 24 years, 25, 26. And then at 5 o'clock, you know, all the offices let out, and you know, just like, it sounds corny, but the beauty of the whole the Latina people that just lived there trying to make a living, and young ladies coming home from work, the pride they took in themselves as, you know, uh, employed. You know, it was, I think you could say, integrated immigration community, and then you had the old money, you know, and some of the screwiest highways you've ever seen in your life. I mean, planned by whom, I don't know, but it was a cattle town. You know, San Antonio was you had between San Antonio and Fort Worth, you had the Chisholm Trail, and it went right up through a little town called Blanco, where I ended up living for many years. Um, I don't know. I have a new record coming out sometime in the next couple of months called Tales of the Free Mexican Airforce. And it features, again, Flaco Jimenez on accordion, and Los Tex Maniacs is the band that I collaborated with on it. And it's all new songs and some Spanish songs. And then, of course, we did Midnight Moonlight. Free Mexican Airforce, and something else we did. But it's all new songs, and I think it's not meant to be a tribute to acoustic folk music, dance music. That's what I did when I first recorded the Free Mexican Airforce. That's all there was. It had no bass, no nothing, just bajo, sexto, accordion, and me playing guitar. But I'd always heard the connection between. I mean, rhythmically, there's such a total connection with the bluegrass kind of rhythm. It's just a different shape to the overall structure.
So that song Midnight Moonlight has the beautiful verses and choruses, and then there's this 2-chord kind of jam section. Was that part of the original, or did you add that for people to just kind of like
I wanted to
listen?
do something that would excite David Grisman.
Oh,
Because David was always like, "Oh, ho hum," we've already done that. Let's do something else. And really, what those chords are R&B chords from Otis Redding's. Let's see. Well, I've been loving you too long. I can't stop now. Da, 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 da. Yeah, it comes from. It's everywhere. It's in Hawaiian music. It's in Spanish music, and I just like those chords. If I wasn't going to sing "I've been loving you too long," I was going to put the chords in somewhere. I just like that on the guitar. I just think it's a tremendous lift. And funny enough, Tony had variations of that. He loved that because you could play down through those changes. There are only 2 chords, but you could play down through the changes. A lot of inversions and passing chords. So that was always fun. Um, yeah, Midnight Moonlight. I mean, if you listen to the words, they're about somebody about to. Sounds like they're about to end their life. That. You know, a disappointment, dreams that might have been, or love that could have been. Yeah, I had just given notice to Seatrain. I had just left the band. I had quit. I was getting a lot of flack from members of the band. That wouldn't let me sing anymore. Yet they relied on me, and with the new guy they hired, Peter Walsh, I really loved the band again. It was like, I felt empowered by the strength that the new guitarist brought to the band. And I told the leader, I told Andy Kohlberg, I said, man, I like the way things are going. If you want, I'll stay on. And he goes, well, that would suit your needs. And I had no idea what he meant by that, but I think he meant that would put me in a more prominent position as a singer. And I don't think he wanted that. I would have loved to have been more of a singer. That's what having the second guitar in the band did for me. It just freed me up. And then at our last show, they wouldn't let me sing. Oh, it was terrible. It was up in DC. And somebody yelled out, "Let Peter sing one." And Richard Greene said, he is singing, meaning whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, it was too bad.
As a musician, do you think of yourself primarily as a singer, a songwriter, or a player, or a combination? Like, how do
Well,
you
I think
label yourself if you had to?
yeah. I mean, for me personally, the guitar is still a you know I'm going to get new things out of the guitar. I mean, I'm talking about right now. I got to do something a little bit different, but it's something also that it is like what I can do well, which is, I think I'm a good rhythm player, but I also like single string. I mean, not single string, but moving arpeggiated parts, more finger picking style. But when I got off this last tour with the Sam Grisman project, my chops were really up. And I realized that there's this whole world. I do play guitar.
Yep,
Yeah, there's this
I do.
whole incredible world of cross picking You know, but you really have to you have to be in shape to bounce that pick around, you know, and I don't really practice that much right now, but I'm thinking that's going to be, you know, it's a finger picking style played with a flat pick. And that's what I'm into right now is trying to develop that a little bit. So I don't really think of myself. I mean, I know what I can do and I know what I can do well. But when I think about music, I don't think that about my strengths. I think about, geez, my chops are down. I need to practice.
Well, I heard a famous quote. I've heard it before, but I think it was John Hartford said, your limitations are your style."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's true. And I've tried to play to those strengths somewhat. And but here's the thing. I'm a. I'm going to quote Van Morrison. I'm a sanger. I oh, is I have to explain that. I saw Van on an interview on the television, and the interviewer kept insisting that he was writing great songs, and he said, "I'm not a songwriter, okay? I'm a sanger." I just thought,
Gotcha.
oh, Van, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But where my explorations are more vocally, my innovations, I would say. But you know, I mean, I'm a limited. I have limitations, and try and try and be more aware of, we could say, the strengths, but also where's the inspiration leading you? You know, I mean, I can't keep going if I don't. If I if I can't write a new song, you know, I'll put it this way: a new song will give me some areas of strength, and the cycle I'm working on right now is the song is dictating where the tonality is, and I think that's what I'm working on now is just tonality and simplicity. That's what I'm working on. Is like finding that tonality that's unique, and then keeping it really plain.
Well, getting back to that YouTube video of you and the quartet with Tony on the White Dove song, and so it's just
Hmm.
it's so classic because Tony goes, he walks back and he goes, "Play it, Pete," something like that, and you played a solo, which is all on the 5 frets and below, beautiful solo in the key of E, and at the end of it, Tony had this huge grin on his face, like, "Yeah, man, you killed it," and that's how I picture you as a lead guitarist, like you just you have a beautiful sense of timing and hit the right notes, and that's to me is I heard you do that when you played here with the McCourys. It was like you were playing all the Monroe songs and you were playing some lead guitar, and it was just simple stuff, but it really encapsulated the feel of the music.
Yeah, that's what I like. That's what I like.
Yeah.
It's funny, Tony would rip a solo and then he'd look over me and go wild, man. And you know, he wasn't kidding. He was saying, don't be shy. You know,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, occasionally I never rehearse solos. But if I do a solo, I just like that to be whatever I can find at that moment, that is what my solo is.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
one of my great inspirations, an inspiration that was just really strong for me was Lightning Hopkins. And, you know, I did at one point kind of get Black Mountain Rag together, but my strength is in the blues, I think. So that's what's
Yeah.
behind all that, you know.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, space. Yeah.
Bass. Yeah. Well, I did ask at one of my earlier podcasts. I was talking to Todd Phillips,
Yeah.
and I said, Todd, how has your bass playing changed now from when you were playing back in the day with those guys, Grisman? And he says, well, I play a lot less notes and I try to play the right ones, he said.
Yeah, man. That's right.
I thought that was an interesting, it's a simple, kind of a funny way of talking about it, but actually is probably very profound because you're trying to not play all that junk. You just want to play what's space, as you said, space is so important.
More and more. For me, I like to find one note that is got a tonality about it that makes you want to hit it maybe twice or three times, and then kind of like elaborate on it. And sometimes some solos can only be three notes and just be plenty, just plenty.
I've heard guys play a one-note solo for 16 bars, and it just was like,
yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think we've been here an hour and 20 minutes, and I would talk all night, but I feel like we should cut this down. I mean, I'd love to have you back on again. There's so many questions I have on my list here that I never even got to talk about. But
well, you want to try one more question, and I'll try and not drift.
Well, no, you weren't drifting, but I mean that's what makes this interesting because you're reflecting on your life. And I was going to ask you. Is there anybody in the history of music that you would have liked to have performed or sang with that you didn't have a chance to? And I know you've played with a lot of people. Any missed opportunities or future opportunities?
Well, I really like playing with Steve Earle, and I did have a one moment with Carl Perkins on stage where we did a show at a club over in Long Island called My Father's Place, and Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen were the headliner, and I was the opener. And and Carl Perkins was he was doing his last round, and he came out and did some work in the Commander Cody set.
Yep.
And then I had to come back out for the encore, for the finale or whatever, and just sort of stand around with my acoustic guitar and play along. And we were doing something, and I was Honey Don't or something. I was standing next to Carl Perkins, and I just looked up at him, and I looked at my acoustic guitar like, well, I'm trying to keep up. And he just looked at me and he goes, rock on. I thought that was the best thing I'd ever heard.
Oh man, well that's a good answer to end this discussion on. I've enjoyed this very much. I'm glad I know you're busy. Everybody's looking for a piece of your time, and you need some to take the time off and relax and do nothing. But I do appreciate you coming on here, and I'd love to talk again at some point. I mean, I have so many more questions that we never even got to, but you covered so much, and I appreciate you coming on. It was really interesting talking to you, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I look forward to the next time.
Okay. Good luck with everything.
Thank you. You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast, and thanks for listening. Visit our website, guitartownct.com, for concert and podcast schedules, or just to send us a message. We'd love to hear from you.